So for my third presentation, I'm going to talk about Thomas Jefferson. In particular, I'm going to talk about how he had a moral dilemma with slavery and how he was a hypocrite. So first, I'm going to talk a little about Jefferson and what his beliefs were, and then I'm going to dive into the reasoning why he did what he did and why he was a hypocrite. So to begin, it should be mentioned that Thomas Jefferson was the one to write in the Constitution that all men are created equal. Throughout his life, he was publicly an opponent of slavery, and he was one of the first statesmen anywhere to act to end slavery. He wrote that slavery is an abomination and must be loudly proclaimed as such, but I own that I, nor any other man, has any immediate solution to the problem. He called it a moral depravity and hideous blot. When it came to the new nation that he wanted to create, he thought that slavery presented a great threat to the survival of the new American nation. Along with this, he thought that slavery was contrary to the laws of nature, which decreed that everyone had a right to personal liberty. This can be easily identified in his quotes from the Constitution that all men are created equal. So, looking at this from the outside, I think it was pretty easy for him to have this stance. He was trying to create a new world, per se, with everyone in it having certain rights. From looking at letters that he wrote, I truly believe that he agreed with this, and he did not want slavery. In 1778, he drafted a Virginia law that prohibited the importation of enslaved Africans, and in 1784, he proposed an ordinance that would ban slavery in the Northwest Territories. To support these ordinances and laws, he said in an address to the king that, for the most trifling reasons, and sometimes for no conceivable reasons at all, His Majesty has rejected laws of the most salutary tendency. The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in these colonies, where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But, previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. So he also shows his support to these laws in 1787 when he writes to Edward Rutledge, I congratulate you, my dear friend, on the law of your state, talking about South Carolina, for suspending the importation of slaves, and for the glory you have justly acquired by endeavoring to prevent it forever. This abomination must have an end, and there is a superior bench reserved in heaven for those who hasten it. So, as Jefferson was continuing to advocate for the abolition of slavery, it was unfortunate that slavery was becoming more and more popular. He thought that the ban on the slave trade would weaken slavery, but it only became more widespread and profitable. So what I thought was also interesting about Jefferson was that although he was against slavery, he thought that blacks were the inferior race. He wrote that he thought that white Americans and enslaved blacks constituted two separate nations who could not live together peacefully in the same country. So he ultimately wanted slaves to be emancipated from the country. He thought blacks were racially inferior and as incapable as children. And because he thought that slaves would be upset with their previous owners after being freed, for example, he thought that it was better just to boot them out of the country, and he wanted them to just go back to Africa. So when analyzing some of his writings, it seems that he never really seriously considered having the two races coexist when it comes to the basis of equality. He also said that blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of the body and mind. And to me, this does not sound like someone that truly believes that all men are created equal. It is also inferred from his writings that he thought blacks were cruder and more animalistic than whites. He writes that he found greater beauty in the flowing hair and variable coloration of the Caucasians than in the immovable veil of the black which covered their emotions. He also says that they have a strong and disagreeable odor, and that love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mix of sentiment and sensation. So when I first read all of this, it really appalled me. I mean, I know that at this time the world was different and racism was a lot more prevalent, but the fact that he was referring to the people, although a different race, as basically animals is crazy to me. I think that it's hard to want to truly abolish slavery and think that it's an unjust institution, but refer to the slaves as not humans at all. I think that this inner conflict within his mind hindered Jefferson's thinking, and I think it made it easier for him to stop his fight against slavery, which he will eventually do. And because he thought of the slaves as lesser men, I think he was then able to conceive himself that his behavior towards them was okay and was humane, and that what was happening to them was just fine. What I think is also interesting is that he supposedly had relations with a slave of his called Sally Hemings. She was a slave of mixed race that had been at the home of Jefferson for a long time, and it has been found that he fathered some of her children after his wife Martha had passed away. So this is surprising due to what he viewed blacks and slaves as people, and is another hypocritical and contradictory aspect of his life. So around the time of his early life and after the Constitution was written and enacted, Jefferson was more outward about his hatred of slavery. However, in the 1790s, he started to become silent, and later his emancipation efforts with all the laws that he was trying to pass suddenly just stopped. So Jefferson also owned hundreds of men, women, and children slaves on his Virginia plantation called Monticello, and it was known that he was against slavery, but somehow he still participated in it. And it is inferred that because he had slaves his entire adult life, it made him more debate these moral principles that were held within his head. It is also recorded that he only emancipated a couple slaves throughout his life. And to me, if he was truly against the cause, you would think he wouldn't even have slaves. Or you would think that he would buy them because he had the money and then give them their freedom. And he even tried to protect his own legacy by hiding slaves from his visitors at his plantation. So overall, I think this shows what a hypocrite Thomas Jefferson was. I can't imagine being against something and yet still supporting it. It would be like me hating on Hillary Clinton and saying how much I disliked what she believed in and thought, but yet still voting for her. It just doesn't make any sense. So I think Jefferson was also a coward. Obviously, at this time in history, slavery to a lot of people was what it was. It was okay. It was part of their everyday life. And no matter what, it was going to be hard to change that way of thinking for the better part of America and, more frankly, the world. And it seems from what I've read about Jefferson and in some of his writings, that he was scared for people to hate him and disapprove of him, and he wanted that approval from the people. So Jefferson became president in 1801, and when he started to become silent about the slavery efforts was just before that, around the 1790s. So I think he was more concerned with his political career than his actual morals and what he had been against and fought for so long. And so this is where the moral dilemma of Jefferson arises. He knows that slavery is wrong. He was so proactive about it in the beginning part of his life, yet when he thinks that it's not worth it anymore and that by supporting this anti-slavery movement, it would hurt his political chances, he stopped. The nation was divided, and because he was concerned with the South's support in particular, he decided to defend slavery. Therefore, it was just his own self-interest that he was more concerned about. So when he became president, he still privately was against slavery, but only on rare occasions during his presidency did he actually voice it. And he did this in letters to people that shared his same views, and he was really careful to keep this from the public. So an example of this when he was president is in a letter from a slave trader turned abolitionist who was trying to get his support for an emancipation tract. He did not want to endorse his request. Instead, he wrote to another colleague, and this is what he said. The cause in which he embarks is so holy, the sentiments he expresses in his letter so friendly, that it is highly painful to me to hesitate on a compliance which appears so small, but that it is not its true character, and it would be injurious even to his views for me to commit myself on paper by answering his letter. I have most carefully avoided every public act or manifestation on that subject. Should an occasion occur in which I can interpose with decisive effect, I shall certainly know and do my duty with promptitude and zeal. So this just shows that he had already given up on what he calls the expectation of an early provision for the extinguishment of slavery among us. Therefore, this is just another example where it seems that his actions are more towards muting the issue of slavery rather than trying to resolve it. Another reason why I think Jefferson stopped his efforts on slavery was because he thought it would cause violence throughout the South and racial prejudice in the North. He writes that he was concerned that agriculture on large farms dependent on slave labor would collapse without a subjugated labor force. And although he was right about violence that would eventually erupt with wanting a ban on slavery, it does not constitute him stopping his efforts, in my opinion at least. So Jefferson was a man of many dimensions, and his behavior was full of contradictions, as I have shown. He was a sincere and dedicated foe of the slave trade, who also bought and sold men whenever he found it personally necessary. He believed that all men were entitled to life and liberty, yet he tracked down those slaves who had the courage to take their rights by running away. He believed that slavery was morally and politically wrong, but he still wrote a slave code for his state and opposed a national attempt in 1819 to limit the further expansion of slavery. He wrote that 1 hour of slavery was worse than ages of British oppression, but yet he was still able to discuss the matter of slave breeding like that of breeding dogs or horses. Therefore, his words that he expressed were against slavery and expressed his hatred for the institution, but what he actually did not live up to his words at all. And in the end, he did what benefited him the most and what was socially popular or relevant to his personal or political security. Therefore, when Jefferson stated in 1820 that, I can say with conscious truth that there is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve us from this heavy reproach in any practical way, I think he was in denial. This was more towards the end of his life, and I think he was trying to save good face and make up for his lack of action in the past. So, more to conclude, I want to read a quote by Jefferson that he wrote in 1825, and it says, "At the age of 82, with one foot in the grave and the other uplifted to follow it, I do not permit myself to take part in any new enterprises, even for bettering the condition of man, not even in the great one which is the subject for your letter, and which has been through life that of my greatest anxieties. The march of events has not been such as to render its completion practical within the limits of time allotted to me, and I leave its accomplishment as the work of another generation. The abolition of evil is not impossible. It ought never, therefore, to be despaired of. Every plan should be adopted, every experiment tried, which may do something towards the ultimate object." So this quote just clearly shows that he was trying to abolish slavery. And he was over trying to abolish slavery. And in his early days, he was such an advocate for the cause, but in the end, he just turned away from it. He was more concerned with his political career and self-interest and thought that it was just a cause for another generation to figure out. So this is also inferred when he says, this enterprise is for the young, for those who can follow it up and bear it through to its consummation. So therefore, the problem that I highlighted in this presentation was his moral dilemma with slavery. Throughout his whole life, it was something that he struggled with, and to many people, it was confusing because he seemed to have contradicting views. How he had slaves, thought they were lesser people, wanted them out of the country, but somehow still wanted them free and thought that they had rights. So in the end, though, his solution was just to ignore the cause and not fight hard for it or fight really at all. He was too focused on his own well-being and career to help those who were really in need. So to me, Thomas Jefferson was a coward, and he just decided to put it on the next generation and hope for the best. Thank you.